Hello, my name is Gene Baur. I'm the president and co-founder of Farm Sanctuary and the author of the book Farm Sanctuary: Changing Hearts and Minds About Animals and Food. And I've got a series of questions here that I'll be answering, and I guess we might as well just get started. Okay, so first question is, what is Farm Sanctuary: Changing Hearts and Minds About Animals and Food about? Well, the book is about our experience starting Farm Sanctuary and learning about the issues of factory farming and rescuing animals from the cruel system of factory farming. And it also talks a little bit about my personal history about growing up in Los Angeles, wanting to do something positive in the world, and ultimately, after working in human rights organizations, environmental organizations, and various other groups, gravitating towards factory farming as an issue that was not getting the attention it needed. So the book, Farm Sanctuary: Changing Hearts and Minds About Animals and Food, talks about the growth of Farm Sanctuary, the work we're doing, talks about the issues, talks about some of the conditions that I witnessed visiting factory farms, and some of the experiences I've had with various people. So it's a neat book about the history of Farm Sanctuary and the work we do. Second question is, why did you write Farm Sanctuary? Well, I wrote the book to put this information on paper and make it accessible. I think the more people learn about and talk about and think about what happens to animals on factory farms and recognize the consequences of our food choices, the better. So the book Farm Sanctuary is, I think, a very useful tool for people to read, to learn about these issues, but also to give to friends. And having the book has also proven to be a very useful tool in terms of just legitimizing these issues. When you have a book that's been published, it's sort of a concrete reminder that this is an issue that deserves some attention. So the next question is, what does the Farm Sanctuary organization do? Well, Farm Sanctuary operates sanctuaries for rescued farm animals, and this started out of our investigations to farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses, where we would literally find living animals left in trash cans or living animals thrown on piles of dead animals. So we started rescuing them, taking care of them, and we now operate 3 sanctuaries, one in upstate New York in Watkins Glen, New York, one in Orland, California, north of Sacramento, and one just outside of Los Angeles, California. And these sanctuaries are places where the animals get to live out their lives, but they're also places where people get a chance to interact with and get to know cows and pigs and chickens and turkeys as living, feeling creatures, to actually look into their eyes, to pet them, to give pigs belly rubs, and pigs are amazing about loving belly rubs. So these are sanctuaries for animals, but they're also places of transformation for the animals and for the people who visit, who get to understand these individuals and look at them in a new way. Because most of us in this country, including myself as I was growing up, were raised eating animals without thinking about it. So Farm Sanctuary is a place where we come into contact with other animals who have been seen primarily as food, and we encourage people to look at them as friends instead. And in addition to our shelters and our education work, Farm Sanctuary advocates for reforms. We've worked on some legislation, for example, that bans the inhumane confinement of animals in cages and crates where they're packed so tightly they can't even turn around and stretch their limbs. We've been able to get several laws passed in various states across the U.S. We're working on federal legislation that also aims to ban that kind of inhumane confinement of animals. Some of the systems that we've dealt with are veal crates for calves, and to raise veal, young calves are chained by the neck in these 2-foot wide wooden crates, and that's where they live their whole lives. We've been able to ban that in some states. Another confinement system are gestation crates. This is how breeding pigs are kept in these 2-foot wide metal enclosures, and they live that way practically their whole lives, unable to turn around, to ever go outside, to exercise, to engage in basic normal behavior. We've been able to ban gestation crates in several states. And the third confinement system is battery cages, and this has to do with egg-laying hens. They put them in cages where they're packed so tightly they can't even stretch their wings. They're constantly scraping against these wire mesh bars. Their feathers wear off. They have bruises and abrasions on their bodies, and they live that way for a year before they're killed. So we've been able to ban these battery cages in some states as well. And then the other legislative issue we've put a lot of energy into has to do with downed animals, animals too sick to walk. And they have literally been dragged onto trucks, taken to slaughter, and sometimes pushed with forklifts, and then killed for human food. So we think that if an animal is too sick to walk, they should be humanely euthanized or given proper veterinary care to be made healthy. They shouldn't be dragged onto trucks and treated just like pieces of meat from the, they should be seen as living, feeling creatures and dragging downed animals to slaughter we think is inappropriate. And we've been able to ban the marketing of downed cows for human food, but we still need to continue working to ban pigs that are too sick to walk, and sheep and goats and other animals too sick to walk from going into the food supply. So farm sanctuary works to rescue animals, to educate people about cruelty, and also to advocate for reforms. What was it that pushed you towards the work you do with animals today? Well, I grew up in a world where there was lots of suffering and misery and violence around me. I grew up in Hollywood, California. There was lots of gang violence. On television, there was the Vietnam War. And I just didn't want to be a cog in a wheel of a system that I thought was causing so much harm. So I started getting involved with human rights organizations, with environmental organizations, and I always just wanted to make a difference and to do something positive. And as time went, I learned that industrialized animal farming was something that affected the lives of billions of animals, as well as the lives of millions of people and our Earth. And it was an issue that was not getting a lot of attention back in 1986, so that's why I decided to focus full steam ahead on the issue of factory farming. And so I started visiting farms, finding animals left for dead, and started taking them home. When I first started visiting these places, the initial reason was to just understand what was happening. And then the rescue work evolved out of these visits. You know, when you find an animal left in a trash can or on a pile of dead animals, you take action and you take the animal out of that situation. And so that is how the sanctuary began, and it has grown since then. We now care for around 1,000 animals between our various sanctuaries, and we work to educate people, because at the end of the day, in addition to rescuing animals, we need to change the system. There's no sanctuary in the world that can rescue the 10 billion farm animals that are raised and slaughtered every year in the US. So, okay, so then the next question is, why did you decide to go vegan in 1985? Well, in 1985, going vegan was a pretty rare thing for people to do. As I learned about the consequences of my food choices, and as I recognized that I didn't have to eat animals, and that eating animals caused the animals to suffer, it caused an enormous footprint on our planet, and it wasn't healthy, it made sense to go vegan. And it's one of the best decisions I've ever made. And I think most people who've decided to go vegan share a similar experience. It's very empowering. And when I went vegan, I actually started eating a wide variety of foods I had never tried before. Different ethnic foods. You also start combining things in different ways. You start becoming more creative in the kitchen. But I went vegan just because it seemed to make sense, and it was aligned with my own values, because I didn't want to support this system that was so abusive to animals and wasting and squandering so many scarce resources on our planet. And it was also healthier, so it was in my interest to eat food that was plant-based instead of animal-based. My first glimpse of the fact that I was eating animals was in high school, and I had come home from something, and my mother had made a chicken dinner, and I saw this bird on the plate with the legs and wings attached. So this was a bird just laying on his or her back, and it was apparent to me I was eating animals, and it didn't sit well. So I actually didn't eat meat during a lot of high school. But then, us human beings are social animals, and I started, adopting and continuing to adopt the habits of those around me, and I went back to eating meat. But in the early 1980s, I traveled across the country, actually hitchhiked across the country, and visited some farming areas and met with many activists, and I learned that you could live without eating animals. And so I went vegan in 1985, and thankfully more and more people today are deciding that living a vegan lifestyle makes a lot of sense. Even people like Bill Clinton are talking about being vegans, and it's a very good thing to see. How did Farm Sanctuary get its start in 1986? Well, back in 1986, there was not a lot of attention being focused on factory farming and the way animals were being raised for food in the US, so I felt it was important to visit these places. And so Farm Sanctuary began just with an idea of exposing the cruelty of factory farming. And we've evolved from that. And we've started by visiting places, rescuing animals. And in addition to rescuing animals, we wanted to prevent those animals from having to be rescued in the first place. One of the places that we first went to was Lancaster Stockyards in Pennsylvania, and behind the stockyard was a dead pile, and we would sometimes find living animals on this dead pile, and we would rescue them and care for them. And at a certain point, the stockyard agreed to turn over these down and dying animals to us, and that was a step in the right direction, but it became apparent that there were so many of these downed animals and that the stockyard needed to implement policies to prevent them from being sent there in the first place. We didn't want to continue cleaning up their mess and basically taking responsibility for these neglected animals that the stockyard could just shuffle off to us. So we then started working on changing the system, and that's what Farm Sanctuary continues to do. We continue to rescue animals, but we also try to change the system so these animals don't have to be rescued in the first place. And a big part of that too has to do with consumer awareness. Most people are unwittingly supporting a factory farming system that treats animals terribly, that is destroying our planet, and is also actually bad for our health. So, Farm Sanctuary got its start just trying to find out what was happening, and as time has gone, we've developed various responses to the problems, rescuing animals, educating people, and advocating for reforms. Why focus on farm animals rather than human suffering? Well, there are many organizations that focus on human suffering, and I think as human beings, it's easier for us to understand other human beings because we are human beings. But farm animals suffer enormously, and farm animals have feelings, farm animals have complex social worlds, emotional worlds, cognitive abilities, and they have been neglected, and that's why we focus on farm animals, because they need us and they have not received adequate time and attention. How has public opinion on the issues of farm animals and food changed since Farm Sanctuary began? Well, in 1986, there was very little attention being focused on factory farming. Today, I'm very happy to say there's a large mainstream recognition that factory farming is harmful. There's people in rural communities who have suffered because of their direct experience with factory farms. Our health in this country is very poor in many cases because of the way we're eating. And so there's a recognition that our food choices are causing us to be unhealthy, and so and that's connected to factory farming. So there's that recognition happening now. The United Nations put out a report a couple years ago called Livestock's Long Shadow, and in that report they talked about how the livestock industry is a bigger contributor to global warming than the entire transportation industry, that the livestock industry is one of the top contributors to the most serious environmental problems we're facing today. So there's more recognition now than ever before, and I'm really happy to see that. So in the last 25 years, we've seen an enormous growth in awareness, and we're also starting to see a movement towards farmers markets, which are growing all over this country, toward community-supported agriculture programs, towards more and more people adopting plant-based eating lifestyles, like even Bill Clinton, Ellen DeGeneres, and it's a very, very positive thing to see. Could you tell us about some of the animals that Farm Sanctuary has rescued and the conditions they came from? Well, over the years, we've rescued thousands of animals, but I will mention a couple that I was involved with taking care of, and the first one is Opie. Well, actually, I'll talk with Hilda. Hilda's the first animal that we rescued. She was a sheep who was sent to Lancaster Stockyards in Pennsylvania, and during transportation, where she was crowded very tightly, she passed out because it was a very hot summer day when she was transported, and she passed out from heat exhaustion. So the truck driver, when she didn't get up and walk off the truck, just drove around back to unload the dead animals, and there were several dead ones in the truck, and he dumped these dead sheep on the dead pile and then dumped Hilda on the dead pile, and she was down and unconscious, and he probably thought she was dead, but she was alive. So the next day I came by this pile of dead animals and saw dead cows and dead pigs and dead sheep. The maggots were there devouring these carcasses. They were so thick you could hear them buzzing. And out of this pile, this lamb lifts her head. So we took her off the dead pile, put her in our Volkswagen van, which Farm Sanctuary started in, took her to a veterinarian, and as the veterinarian started examining her, she stood up, and then she started eating, and she did very well. So Hilda lived with us for more than 10 years. That was the name we gave her. Another of the rescued animals is Opie. He's a calf that I found at a stockyard in upstate New York. He was sent to the stockyard on the day he was born. He was still wet from afterbirth. It was a freezing day, and he was dying of hypothermia. Now, Opie was born on a dairy farm. For dairy cows to produce milk and to be profitable, they have to have a calf every year. Half of the calves born are female, so they're raised to replace the dairy cows in the milking herd because they burn them out very quickly. They need a constant supply of these female calves to grow into cows, to become milking cows. The other half of the calves born on dairy farms are males, and they're useless to the dairy industry because obviously they're never going to produce milk. So the dairy industry sometimes will send them to the stockyard on the day they're born, which is what happened with Opie. So I come across this calf, and I asked the stockyard worker what was happening, because he was laying in the alleyway. He was clearly in bad shape. He was crumpled up and looked terrible. And the stockyard worker said, well, I have to bury him later today. And I said, well, what if I take him off your hands? And he said, sure, go ahead and take him. So I took him to the veterinarian, and she gave him intravenous fluids and cared for him. And he recovered, and he lived with us for 18 years and ended up weighing close to 3,000 pounds. So he was a gentle giant on the farm. So that was Opie. And then the last animals I'll mention that I rescued are Easter and Lily. They're two hens that I found at an egg factory in New Jersey. And I visited this egg factory to videotape and take pictures of battery cages where you have hens packed so tightly they can't even stretch their wings. And as I was getting ready to leave this battery cage operation, I came across a trash can full of dead hens. And as I got closer to that trash can, I noticed there were a couple of them that were moving and were alive. So I took those hens out of the trash can and took them to the veterinarian to care for them, and then brought them to Farm Sanctuary. So those are some of the animals that we've rescued over the years. And all the animals that come to Farm Sanctuary have come from abuse cases, and they get to live out their lives, and they get to be treated as our friends instead of our food once they come to Farm Sanctuary. Time magazine recently called you the conscience of the food movement. What do they mean by that? I'm not sure what they mean by that. I think that, since 1986, Farm Sanctuary and I have been speaking out about the fact that these are living, feeling animals. They're not commodities. And I think that that is a statement that speaks to our human conscience and awareness. So perhaps that's what they meant by that. But I think the way we eat says a lot about us, and the way we treat other animals says a lot about us. And what we're doing in our country today is abysmal. And when people think about it, I think they're upset. And so I think a lot of times people say, I don't want to know, don't tell me about it. And what we try to do at Farm Sanctuary is to encourage people to think about it and to acknowledge it. And instead of saying, I don't want to know, look and take responsibility for the way we're eating and for the consequences of our food choices. So, perhaps that's what being the conscience of the food movement is about. So what are some of the major campaigns that Farm Sanctuary is now working on? Well, Farm Sanctuary works on various things. In addition to rescuing animals, we do an awful lot to educate people. So we're constantly reaching out and encouraging people to think about their food choices and to recognize farm animals as living, feeling creatures, not as inanimate chunks of meat, which is, a big part of what we do is education. So we put out videos, we tell the animal stories, we encourage people to come to the sanctuaries and visit the animals. And then on the advocacy front, we're going to be working on the Farm Bill in 2012 and encouraging that government policy not support these industrialized animal operations as it has for decades. So that's going to be a big push in Washington, D.C. We're also going to be working on federal legislation in Washington to ban battery cages so that egg-laying hens are not confined in these small wire enclosures where they can't stretch their wings, and that's where they live their whole lives that way. So those are a couple of our upcoming legislative efforts. This past summer you went on the Just Eats tour. What did you learn? Well, for the Just Eats tour, we took the old Volkswagen van that Farm Sanctuary started in. And when Farm Sanctuary started back in 1986, we were an all-volunteer, very small organization. We funded the organization by selling vegetarian hot dogs out of our Volkswagen van at Grateful Dead concerts. So we got the van back on the road this year for our 25th anniversary, and we started at our gala in New York City. This is a black tie, star-studded, fancy gala at Cipriani's on Wall Street. And so the van started there, and it was great to see so many people, celebrities, enjoying great vegan food and celebrating the evening. And then from there we headed cross-country, and along the way I found vegans in every corner of this country, from Erie, Pennsylvania to Chicago to Omaha, Nebraska to Tulsa, Oklahoma, Phoenix, Arizona. And then we finished the Just Eats tour at our sanctuary in Orland, California. So we started at this New York City black tie gala, and finished at our hoedown at our farm to show the diversity of the vegan movement. And it was such a great thing to see. And what I was struck by was the enthusiasm and the hopefulness and the positive feelings among people who've adopted a vegan lifestyle. And I saw that in every part of the country. So that was really, for me, the big takeaway. Is it difficult to be vegan? What are some of your favorite things to eat? It's getting a lot easier to be vegan. Back in 1986, for soy milk, we used to have this powder we would mix with water. So that was soy milk. Now you can get soy milk in regular grocery stores. It's widely available. You can also get lots of great vegan alternatives to meat. You can get veggie burgers, veggie hot dogs, and you can also get vegan food that doesn't try to emulate meat. So vegan food is widely available, and I would say it's very easy to be vegan today. And what are some of my favorite things to eat? I love ethnic food. I like Ethiopian food, for example. When I'm home, I make these green smoothies because I'm trying to eat healthier. And to make the green smoothies I make, I have a Vitamix, which is like a heavy-duty blender, and I use kale and maybe spinach or some other green. Greens are excellent. And then I put blueberries and bananas in there, flaxseed, and some kind of non-dairy milk, either a soy milk or a rice milk or a hemp milk or an oat milk or an almond milk, and blend that up. And if I want it sweeter, I'll add a date or two. And so that's one of my favorite things to eat when I'm at home, and it's very healthy and very nourishing, and I really enjoy that. So how do the meat, dairy, and egg industries affect the environment? Man, the meat, dairy, and egg industries confine animals by the thousands in close quarters. And so those animals are generating tons and tons of manure, which then goes into waterways. And oftentimes also, that manure is contaminated with pathogens that can be resistant to antibiotics. Half of the antibiotics produced in the United States go into farm animals. So when there are pathogens, where there are certain types of E. coli or Campylobacter or some other kind of pathogen in these animals, and they're being fed these antibiotics, the strains of those bacteria that are resistant are the ones that survive, and those can get into the environment. So around these factory farms, you have waterways and land that is polluted. You have noxious fumes being emitted into the air. Neighbors in these environments have suffered terribly because of this pollution. But you also have an enormous drain on resources. To produce meat, milk, and eggs requires huge quantities of land and water to grow grain to feed these animals. And it requires huge amounts of fossil fuels as well. There was a New York Times article a few years ago called Rethinking the Meat Guzzler, talking about how inefficient it was from a fossil fuel standpoint to produce foods from animals instead of eating plants directly. And the author of the article concluded it took 16 times more fossil fuels to produce a meat meal as opposed to a vegetarian meal. So the animal agriculture is one of the top contributors to some of our most serious environmental problems according to the United Nations. So it's a very important thing to look at. How do you feel about people who boycott factory farms but eat meat, milk, and eggs from local, family-owned, and organic farms? Well, I think people who are saying no to factory farms have the right instinct and don't want to support cruelty. But I would also say that oftentimes products that are being sold as free range or organic tend to sound a lot better than they are. Products that are sold as free range, for example, it only is required that those come from animals that are given access to the outdoors. But access to the outdoors is not defined. So what you sometimes have, and in many cases you have, is animals that are confined by the thousands in these warehouses where there's a small door that goes out to a crummy little paddock, and that is technically access to the outdoors. But it's not what people expect when they're buying free range. So I would say that a lot of those products have labels that are misleading. And I think consumers' instincts are good. Consumers don't want to support factory farming cruelty, but unfortunately they're still supporting conditions that are much worse than they assume they are. And of course, the easy solution to this is just to eat plant foods instead of animal foods, and then you don't need to worry about what the labels say, because you know if it's a piece of broccoli, it didn't come from an animal that was killed. Recently, agribusiness has backed legislation in several states to make it illegal to take pictures or video on factory farms. Has their effort been successful? Well, last year there were 4 states that were considering legislation to make it illegal to take pictures and videotape at factory farms and to distribute those. Thankfully, all 4 of those bills were defeated, but there are already some states that have laws on the books to make it illegal to take pictures on farms. And I think that this really speaks to agribusiness's desire to hide what they're doing. But I don't believe that those efforts can be successful. I think that in this country, thankfully, we have the First Amendment. We have the right to free speech, and that is a right that we will assert if we need to. And I think that ultimately, the truth has a way of coming out. And despite any effort agribusiness may put forward to hide what is happening, they may be successful in the short term, but in the long term, I think that these conditions will be exposed, and I think ultimately people will be able to make informed choices. How do you see the future of the movement to oppose factory farming? Well, I think right now we have a convergence of issues. We have people more aware than ever before about the cruelty of factory farming with the internet, with videos, with pictures being made available online. We also have more and more awareness about the health consequences of our animal consumption and the factory farming system. And we also have more awareness about the environmental problems. So we have a convergence of issues right now, and I think that increasingly animal groups will work with health organizations and will work with environmental groups and rural community organizations to come together to oppose this system, which is harmful in so many ways. Farm Sanctuary recently acquired a 3rd farm animal sanctuary, Animal Acres, near Los Angeles. Why? Well, one of our big initiatives at Farm Sanctuary is to share the animal stories and to bring the sanctuary experience to a wider audience. And when the board of Animal Acres here in the Los Angeles area came to us and asked us to help out and to take care of the animals and to ultimately take over the operation, we felt it was a good opportunity to do so. So they came to us because they needed some help, and we were happy to provide it. In October, Farm Sanctuary is hosting the first national conference to end factory farming to bring together environmentalists, public health professionals, and animal activists around the issue of factory farming. Can you tell us about the conference? Yeah, I'd love to tell you about the conference. It's happening from October 27th to October 29th, and we're bringing together people from various organizations that all share the same concerns about factory farming. We think that the factory farming system is unsustainable, it is cruel, it is unhealthy, and needs to be stopped. So we have environmental groups, health organizations, business people, journalists, humane organizations, all joining together under the same banner and under the same desire to end factory farming, and I'm really looking forward to it. Well, for many years, big agriculture wanted to ignore animal activists and wanted to dismiss our concerns as trivial. But as time has gone, and as we've been able to demonstrate to agribusiness that most citizens do not accept what they're doing as okay. Most citizens consider what factory farms do as outside the bounds of appropriate conduct in our society. They've started responding because ultimately they depend on consumers to buy their products. So agribusiness is still digging in many ways. But there are starting to be some cracks around the edges, and there's starting to be some recognition that change needs to happen. So some of the largest pork industry groups and veal industry groups, for instance, have announced that they plan to phase out the crates where animals can't even turn around. So the American Veal Association has talked about now phasing out veal crates. I think that's positive. Smithfield, the world's largest pork producers, is talking about phasing out gestation crates. That's also positive. And the United Egg Producers, which represents most of the egg producers in the United States, has agreed to support legislation to ban battery cages, which is also very positive. Now, unfortunately, the conditions that will be used to replace those confinement systems are not going to be that great. They're going to be better, animals will suffer less, but they will still ultimately be factory farming conditions. And that's something that ultimately we need to continue addressing, continue pushing things forward. What's your advice for someone who wants to go vegetarian or vegan but doesn't know where to start? Well, I would say, thankfully, there's more and more information available now online. There's also organizations and local vegetarian groups that you can go to and ask about where to get vegan food and where to start. There's also vegan restaurants or restaurants that provide vegan food in communities all over the country. So it's getting easier and easier. And so I would just say, go online and maybe do a Google search for vegan food or vegan in the name of your city or vegan restaurants. And there's a great website called Happy Cow that has lists of restaurants that provide vegan food all over the country and all over the world. So this information is more and more accessible. But I think one of the biggest obstacles for people is sometimes that they don't have the social support. If somebody in a family wants to go vegan and everybody else around them is critical of that decision, it can be really challenging. So it's important to get to know people who support that vegan living choice. And at Farm Sanctuary, we have members all over the country, so people can go to our website, which is farmsanctuary.org, get a hold of us. We have resources. We can put you in touch with people in your neighborhood. But it's important to connect with other people who share your concerns because we are social animals and we are very much affected by those around us, and it's important to be supported. How do you respond to critics who say people need to eat meat for protein and health reasons? Well, we grew up in this country believing that we needed to eat meat, and I was actually raised with that belief. But as a matter of fact, we do not need to eat meat for protein or any other nutritional needs. And I've been a vegan since 1985. I get everything I need by eating plants instead of animals. And I think that we need to recognize this idea that eating meat is necessary is completely a myth. We can get everything we need by eating plants instead of animals. And so for those that believe we need to eat meat, I would just encourage them to rethink that assumption and look around them and see that there's a lot of people who are living without eating meat. So it's clear that we can live without eating any animal foods, or any meat, or any other animal foods. How do you feel as an advocate of living a healthy lifestyle and treating animals better? What kind of impact the film Forks Over Knives can and should have on Americans especially? Well, I think the movie Forks Over Knives is an excellent resource, and it makes it very clear that our health in this country is suffering significantly because of the way we eat. And we can change our health, we can change how we feel, we can improve our lives by shifting to eating whole plant foods and away from eating animal foods the way we do in this country. It's tragic when you look at our health and how people are suffering and how people are dying much too early, and how we're killing billions of animals unnecessarily. And the movie Forks Over Knives makes it very clear that shifting how we can eat can have a huge impact, a very positive impact on how we feel and how we live. So I highly recommend the movie Forks Over Knives. Well, in our country, we eat way too much meat and too many dairy products, and we can live without eating any of them. And because of the way we eat, and because of our consumption of meat and dairy products, we're suffering. The number one killer in our country is heart disease. The number two killer is cancer. The risks of both can be seriously lessened by shifting to eating plants instead of eating animals. We grow up with these incorrect notions that eating meat and dairy is necessary and healthy. And if that were the case, we wouldn't see the problems we see in our country with health. The dairy industry would like us to believe that we need to drink cow's milk in order to get calcium to prevent osteoporosis. But if drinking cow's milk did prevent osteoporosis, we shouldn't have it in our country because we drink a lot of cow's milk and we also have a lot of osteoporosis. So drinking cow's milk is clearly not the answer to our problems with osteoporosis. And so, again, we need to challenge these myths that we grow up with, that eating meat, milk, and eggs is healthy and necessary. We can live and do very well and, in fact, be healthier without eating any of those products. I can understand why eating meat is bad, but what's wrong with milk and eggs? Animals are not killed for dairy products or eggs, so what's the problem? Well, actually, animals are killed by the dairy and egg industries. It may not appear as directly, but they are killed just as certainly, and in some cases they suffer much longer lives before they're being killed. And I'll just outline these industries. For dairy production, the average life in dairy production, cows are forced to have a calf every year to remain productive and profitable. So immediately after birth, the calf is taken away from the mother. which is a stressful and difficult experience both for the mother and the calf. The calf will be raised for veal in many cases if he's a male, and if the calf is a female, she'll be raised to become a milking cow. But the mother will be taken from the baby and then hooked up to these milk machines, and she's pushed so hard that she produces about 10 times more milk than she would normally. And her body's under intense stress to do this, and she will die at a very young age. In most cases, these animals are sent to slaughter after just 3 or 4 years in production. Whereas in a healthy environment, a cow could live 20 years. So these dairy cows are pushed very hard, they're killed young, and they're eventually used for beef. In the case of the egg industry, there are 2 distinct breeds of chickens in the United States today. There are the meat-type birds and the egg-laying birds. The meat-type birds have been genetically bred to grow twice as big and twice as fast as normal. The egg-laying birds have been genetically bred to put all of their feed energy into egg production. So the egg-type birds don't grow very fast, don't grow very large. So you have hatcheries that hatch these egg-laying hens. Half of the chicks that hatch are male, and because they don't grow fast enough to be raised profitably for meat, and because they'll never lay eggs, they're killed the day they hatch. So in the egg industry, on day 1, you have a 50% mortality rate. So that's, hundreds of millions of chicks being killed every year because of the egg industry. And I've been to some of these hatcheries, and I've seen how these unwanted males are killed. I've seen dumpsters full of unwanted male chicks just dying, being suffocated as they get piled on top of each other. I've been to hatcheries where these unwanted male chicks are being thrown into a manure spreader to be spread on the field as manure while they're alive. So these are the byproducts of the egg industry. And then the female chicks are raised to become egg-laying hens, and they live all their lives indoors, in warehouses, in cages. And they live in these battery cages, which are lined up in rows, stacked in tiers in huge factory warehouses. They're packed so tightly that each is given less space than a sheet of paper. They can't stretch their wings. They end up with bruises and abrasions on their bodies from constantly scraping against these wire bars. And they're killed after a year of that. So these hens are also killed. And that's, in some ways the egg industry and the dairy industry are worse than the meat industries because the animals live a long, tortured life, and then they're killed for meat. How do today's slaughterhouses compare with those in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle? Well, I wasn't around when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, but I've read it. And I believe that the conditions today are just as bad in many ways. You have slaughterhouses that are moving faster. You have animals that are still being seen as commodities. You have live animals that are being dismembered while still alive and conscious today. You have live animals who are being killed when they are dunked into the scalding tank and boiled alive. So today we just have a much faster, bigger system than we did when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. So although there might be some regulations, there's the Federal Meat Inspection Act, for example, that was passed as a result of The Jungle. You still have an industry that is massive, that is moving too fast, that is causing animals to suffer horribly, and that is also very much hidden from public view. So I would say the conditions are just as bad today as they were back then. And unfortunately, most people don't see it and don't think enough about it and are unwittingly supporting it. Absolutely. We love it when people come to Farm Sanctuary and meet the animals. Magical things happen when people get a chance to see a cow or a pig or a chicken or a turkey in a new way. It's transformational. And we love it when people come visit our farms, and people can go to our website, farmsanctuary.org, with information about visiting the farms and also about events that we have at the sanctuaries and our overnight cabins. People can actually come and stay overnight at some of our sanctuaries and wake up and look out the window or sit on the porch and see the pigs out there rooting or the cows out there grazing. It's a beautiful sanctuary for animals and also for people, so we encourage people to come visit. So what can ordinary people do to stop cruelty to farm animals? Well, the single most important thing each of us can do to prevent cruelty to farm animals is to decide not to support that system and to adopt a vegan lifestyle. If we're not eating these animals, then the factory farming system is not going to raise them. So that's the single most important thing any of us can do to take a step against this industry. And there are many things in our world that are out of our control. There's lots of wars going on, there's lots of violence, there's enormous destruction all over the planet. And a lot of these things can seem very much outside of our sphere of influence. But when it comes to what we eat and how those choices affect our world, we have a lot of control. And each of us can make a choice every day to not support factory farming and to choose locally produced plant-based foods instead of animals that are raised in these horrible conditions. So best thing we can do to stop cruelty to farm animals and also to improve our own health and to lighten our footprint on the planet is to adopt a vegan lifestyle. What does how we treat animals say about us as a society? Well, Mahatma Gandhi said the moral progress of a nation can be judged by its treatment of animals. And I think that's really true, especially when it comes to farm animals who are so much at our mercy and so under our control that, when we do bad things to them, that says something about us. When one group has a lot of power over another group and treats the other group with disdain or callousness or disregard, that says a lot more about the group in power than about the group that's being victimized. And you've seen this through human history when you have groups that have a lot of power, how they become mean and abusive and hateful even. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was a teacher in Iowa who did this study basically on her kids, and she wanted to teach them about prejudice. And she came into class and told the students that brown-eyed kids were dumb and blue-eyed kids were smart. And she treated the blue-eyed kids with preferentially, and the brown-eyed kids, had to, go to recess later, and they had to wait for the blue-eyed kids to finish things before they could do things and stuff. And it was not surprising that the discriminated group started losing self-esteem and performing worse on tests. But what this teacher said she was most struck by was how the empowered group, these blue-eyed kids, started treating the brown-eyed kids with such cruelty and became sort of like monsters. And there's that saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And us human beings wield a lot of power over other animals, and it can be corrupting, and we can become, we can start losing our empathy. And I think that is one of the other tragedies that this industry brings, is that we become less human, we become less humane, we become monsters in a sense. And I've seen it at factory farms and at slaughterhouses where the animals are, abused just for the fun of it, and it's something that is bad for the animals and it's bad for the people. I mean, I feel bad for the people that work in these slaughterhouses. Even if they're engaging in these horrendous acts, they've become something less than what we as human beings really are and can be. Aside from farm animals, do you believe our country's animal shelters need to be looked at closer in terms of their conditions? Well, I think in our country we have a wide variety of different kinds of animal shelters. I think that there are some that are operated extremely well, where animals are given very good conditions and are given enriched lives, and they have people regularly visiting them, and they're given, wonderful places to spend their time. There's other shelters that are run in a different way, where animals are sort of warehoused and where they're not provided very good conditions. They're not provided good experiences interacting with people. And those types of shelters, I think, need to be looked at and need to be changed. And ultimately, whether we're talking about farm animals or cats and dogs, we're talking about relationships with other animals. And the question is, what kind of relationships do we want to have with other animals? Are those going to be respectful, compassionate relationships? Or are they going to be callous, cruel types of relationships? And I think when it comes to farm animals, for decades, we've treated them with callous disregard. We've not thought enough about them. We've not thought about how our conduct impacts their lives. And we have not thought about the profound impacts of our food choices. And thankfully that is starting to happen. I think people are starting to recognize that farm animals have feelings too. Farm animals are not that different than cats and dogs. That this idea that cows and pigs and chickens and sheep and turkeys are edibles and cats and dogs are not edibles, you know, those distinctions are really quite arbitrary. In some countries, like in India, for example, cows are considered to be not edible. In other countries, like China, for example, cats and dogs are considered to be edible. So these distinctions really are quite arbitrary. And our point of view at Farm Sanctuary is all these animals are living, feeling creatures. We share the planet with them. We can live with them in a more harmonious, more compassionate way. And that's good for the animals, but it's also good for us. Cruelty to animals is bad for animals. It's also bad for people. It cuts off our empathy, and it doesn't have to be that way. We can live with other animals without killing them. And I think actually our lives are enriched by living with them and enjoying their company. You know, I love going out to the barn at Farm Sanctuary, into the pig barn, and going up to the pigs and giving them a belly rub and watching these 500-pound animals just roll over and just start grunting in pleasure as you're rubbing their bellies. And you know, that does something good for your heart too. In contrast, when somebody's working in a slaughterhouse and you know, over the course of 8 hours, all they're doing is cutting the throats of animals, that does something to you. And it is something that has profound impacts, I think, on the human psyche. And those negative impacts don't just stay at the slaughterhouse. They go home, they are spread. And so cruelty can spread, but compassion also can spread. You know, we are social animals, and the way we conduct ourselves and the way we behave impacts those around us. And by acting with kindness, that can become contagious. And that's really what Farm Sanctuary is about. It's about a community of people who care, who want to make a difference, who want to live in a way that is aligned with our humane values, aligned with our interests, and ultimately change how we treat farm animals, and in doing so, improve not only their lives, but ours as well. Well, thank you all very much for your interest in these issues and for tuning in. For more information about Farm Sanctuary, please check out our website, which is www.farmsanctuary.org. You can also get my book, Farm Sanctuary, Changing Hearts and Minds About Animals and Food, on the Farm Sanctuary website or on Amazon.com or other online retailers. And I just want to thank you. These issues are important. The way we treat other animals says a lot about us. And when we eat animal products, we also harm our own health physically. And we don't have to do it that way. We can live better. We can live in a way that makes a lot more sense. So thank you for your concern and your attention to these issues, and hope you come visit the farm.